Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session, the second in our Monday. And we have Matthew who's actually going to talk to us about his really cool GPT bot, one of the really useful ones that I've seen out there when he's actually using AI, ChatGPT to drive threat modeling with Stride. So, and I think this is, again, one of those massive areas for innovation in our industry. So, Matthew, really looking forward to your thoughts and where it's been used and how you build it.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Great to be here. And yeah, thanks for the invite to come and present. So Stride GPT is a personal project of mine. So I'm really enjoying the opportunity to talk about it and share it with a broader community. So the agenda for the talk today is I'm just going to give a quick introduction to myself, and we'll then walk through a brief overview of Stride itself, the methodology for those that perhaps aren't overly familiar with it. I'll then start to introduce the tool, Stride GPT, some of the key features and updates that I've made to it recently. We'll then jump into some demos. I'll then talk about the adoption and impact I've seen from the tool and people that are using it, some of the feedback that I've had. And we'll wrap up with a look at some of the future plans that I've got for the tool and a bit of Q&A as well. I'm happy to keep things fairly interactive. So just if anyone wants to jump in or there are questions in the chat, Dennis, if you can just flag those up, and I'm happy to cover those off as we go through. So a little bit about me. I've been working in cybersecurity for just about 20 years now. Started off with Deloitte as a consultant in their cybersecurity practice. I think that was even in the days before we called it cyber. It was good old information security then. And I worked with them for 8 or so years, left to set myself up as a contractor with my own company, and then moved on after about 6 or so years back into the world of permanent employee land. And I think in total, what that's given me is a really good understanding of how different companies operate, the challenges that they face when it comes to cybersecurity, and then hopefully some insight into how those can be solved. And so currently I'm working at Santander UK as a security architect. And then when I'm not working, I've got a few different hobbies just to keep things interesting. So I live on a small holding in North Buckinghamshire in England. So I keep some sheep and pigs and ducks. And so when I'm not doing things like messing about with my own personal coding projects, you'll find me out in the field looking after sheep or seeing what's happening across the land. And I just find that's really interesting. It helps to give me a bit of a break and to mull things over. So an overview of Stride for those that perhaps aren't familiar. Stride is a threat modeling methodology. And the name comes from these 3 threat categories that make up the total model. So spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And I think one of the reasons for Stride's popularity is its simplicity at the end of the day. So what will happen when you take Stride and use it as part of a threat modeling exercise is that you look at your web application or your system, break it down into its individual components and services, and then you think about how each of these different threat categories might possibly affect your application or system or the individual components that you're dealing with. So an example would be, perhaps you've got some sort of user authentication mechanism at the front end of your application. Well, clearly spoofing, so that idea that a user can, in an unauthorized way, assume the identity of another user, that threat category is clearly going to be in play. Another one that's quite common for web applications, particularly public-facing ones, is the denial of service threat category, particularly through something like a distributed denial of service, or perhaps even maybe it doesn't have to be a volumetric type attack. It could be if an attacker is able to access your backend database and drop tables from it, that could result in a denial of service condition. And so as part of the Stride process, you'll go through and look with your application developers at all of those components, and for each one, map out the relevant threat categories. And that's, whilst it's simple in nature, there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of opportunity for debate. And I think there's also quite an inherent level of inconsistency. So you often see wildly different levels of detail and just knowledge and understanding about these different threat categories and how they might arise in an application. And while security teams can level some of that out, in my experience, you can still end up with a high degree of variability. And so that's really where the concept from Stride GPT, or for Stride GPT, came from. I was sitting talking to some colleagues one day, and inside Santander, we have a requirement that each application project or development needs to be accompanied by a threat model. And that threat model is reviewed by the security architecture and engineering teams to validate it, and to hopefully remove some of those inconsistencies that I was talking about on the previous slide. And at the time when I was having this conversation, I think it was probably November, December of 22. So there was a lot of news about ChatGPT and the emergence of LLMs, and it was really early days. And I started to think about how we could take a large language model and use it for certain cybersecurity use cases. And helping to generate a threat model felt like a very good use case at that point, because it avoids some of the pitfalls that you'll often see associated with LLMs, like hallucinations. Doesn't necessarily avoid them altogether, but it becomes less critical, because what Stride GPT is doing is it's producing an initial model that people are then working on refining. It's not saying it's the final threat model or the final product. And so, yeah, it's sort of built from the ground up to try and minimize those problems that are associated commonly with LLMs. But sort of going back to the core concept, what I wanted to do with Stride GPT was empower non-security experts. So as I've mentioned already, in my career, I've seen a high degree of variability from different teams when it comes to producing different threat models. And often the way of ironing that out is to put a security expert in the room. But that's quite inefficient. Security resources, particularly senior security architects or engineers, tend to be quite scarce within each company. And so the rationale for Stride GPT was to provide a security person in the room that could help development teams produce their own threat model. I also think that by allowing teams to come up with their own threat model independent of a security expert, it gives them time to think about the potential attack vectors and the potential threats in a lot more detail and in a way that's meaningful for them. I think where you've got inexperienced people, or people who are inexperienced at producing threat models, they can often be led by the security expert in the room. And I think there's a lot of value in allowing those people time to sort of think about what could go wrong in their own sort of mindset, and working that through with the language model, with the Stride GPT tool, and then coming back to someone like a security architect and having a more security aware discussion from both sides. I think there's, I found that there's quite a lot of value in that. And lastly, on this slide, Stride GPT is big on iterative refinement. So as I said earlier, it's not aiming to be, to be a sort of one-shot, here's your final answer threat model. What it's trying to do is produce that starting point. And that's either a starting point for an application development team to take to someone in the security function, or it's, perhaps already partially refined model that the security team and your development teams can then work on to further refine. So what you'll see in the demos in a little while is the improvement suggestions that accompany each threat model as it's produced. And so the idea is if you keep going back and adding more detail, Stride GPT will give you a higher quality of output, and it will give you more information in return for you to think about. And so the quality of your threat model is then really dependent upon how much time you're willing to spend working with the tool and continuing to develop that through that process. So we've got a few key features and recent updates that I've made. So as I said, this tool's a little over a year old, really, from concept to its current form. On version 0.5 at the moment, and in version 0.4 and 0.5, I made some quite significant changes to the tool to make it what it is today. So one of those in version 0.5 was enabling an integration with the Azure OpenAI service. So from almost day one, people in an enterprise setting who came across Stride GPT and liked it said, this is great, but you're only providing support for GPT models that are accessible via the OpenAI API. And we don't have a commercial relationship with OpenAI. And early on, I experimented with enabling support for the OpenAI service, but at the time, there wasn't feature parity between the Azure service and the native OpenAI API. And so it was something that I wasn't happy with the quality when I enabled the Azure OpenAI service. That really changed, though, following OpenAI's Dev Day back in November of last year, when they started to introduce a number of new features. We got some new models, GPT-4 Turbo, and from my perspective, what was really valuable was that the team at Azure moved really quickly and introduced those same features onto the Azure OpenAI service. And when you're using either OpenAI or the Azure API service, it's now a really familiar experience from both aspects, and that makes it as easy as toggling a toggle button in the UI now. And you just replace your API credentials with the Azure OpenAI service credentials, and otherwise the tool operates exactly the same. So that was a really big thing for me. And now if you're an enterprise customer and you've got existing commercial terms and non-disclosure agreements with Microsoft, you can use Stride GPT with that level of confidence. I also, with a nod to making things a bit easier when it comes to deployment, I introduced a new Docker container image that's available on Docker Hub. And so rather than having to build things from scratch, including Streamlit and all of the Python libraries and dependencies that it comes with, you can now just take that image and deploy it onto your own Docker infrastructure or Kubernetes environment. And it just really simplifies things for those looking to quickly test, particularly if they've got containerization set up. In version 0.4, as I mentioned, that there was that Dev Day back in November. I now only support either the latest version of GPT 3.5 Turbo or GPT-4 Turbo, otherwise known as the 1106 preview model, because it was released on the 6th of November. And both of those models really made quite an improvement in terms of their level of steerability. And by that, I mean the attention that they pay to the system prompt that you provide. So under the hood, the way that Stride GPT works is you have a number of you have an application description and a number of other parameters that you capture. So information about your what sensitivity of data you have, what types of authentication you support, whether you've got OAuth or MFA and things of that nature. And each of those pieces of information is taken and put into a prompt template that's then sent over to either the OpenAI API or the Azure OpenAI service with some instructions that say the model is an expert at threat modeling. It should produce a certain output type in a certain format. And in the previous models, or when using the previous models, there was always a degree of variability, and to some extent there still is. It's in the nature of probabilistic language models. But those latest models are really a lot better in terms of paying attention to that prompt and making the output quality really consistent, which makes things a lot easier from the developer's perspective when you need to rely on the format of that output coming back for steps that are further on in the process that you're working in. The other thing that I took advantage of with the latest models was their support for JSON mode. Again, this was released on or announced at the Dev Day. It's a really useful feature that I think more people should consider taking advantage of. And it effectively guarantees that the model will return syntactically correct JSON, which makes things, again, a lot easier. So before I was doing this manually and prompting the models to return a JSON object. And occasionally there would be failures when there was a JSON object returned in a code block or other slight nuances that I couldn't quite account for. But that emergence of that JSON mode or the support for it has really helped because it makes things a lot easier to pass into different sections, as I'll probably explain when we get later on into the demos. In order to take advantage of that JSON mode, though, I now needed to make direct calls to either the OpenAI API or to the Azure OpenAI service. And that meant in version 0.4, I stripped out all of the LangChain framework that I was using. So LangChain, for those that perhaps haven't come across it, is a really popular framework for working with LLMs. And I think there are varying degrees of opinion on how helpful it is. I personally find it very useful for prototyping. They support hundreds of integrations with different services and different LLMs. And it makes it very easy to sort of chop and change between different combinations of those services and language models just to try some things out. But what I ran into, and I think what's probably common from a number of development forums that I've been in and had conversations in, is that you can only really go so far with LangChain, and that by its nature, because it's introducing a level of abstraction for working with those models, if you really need to get down into the detail and tweak that model to your exact requirements, it can end up getting in the way. And that was what I found with version 0.4 when I was trying to do things like take advantage of this JSON mode that was introduced. I just couldn't get the consistency of the outputs through LangChain, and so I decided to effectively rewrite probably about 50% of the code in Stride GPT at that point, to remove LangChain and just to go direct to the native API calls. And lastly,
yeah, sorry, just a quick one.
Yeah.
That was one of the questions I have answered this, because I kind of feel a bit like that. I look at it and there's a lot of things they add, but there's a level of complexity. And also, if you start to coding those workflows yourself, I think you have a lot more power, a lot more capabilities in it.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, it's really helpful at prototyping, and it definitely worked during, up to sort of version 0.3. I really didn't have a problem with it. And as someone who isn't, I'm not a developer by trade, having that ability just to put in, LLM and then define which LLM you wanted, and to be able to chop and change without really having to worry about the particular prompt formats or prompt templates that were being used, really helpful. But once you then go on to that next level of maturity and you're starting to ask some quite specific things, or you're getting very particular with what you want the model to return, that's where it gets a bit harder to work with LangChain. So I think I'm in the camp of there's definitely positives and negatives to its usage, and I think each person, each development team needs to decide whether it's going to work for them, or if they just want to roll up their sleeves and effectively just deal with the APIs directly rather than having that extra layer in the way.
Yeah. What about Streamlit? What's your views on that?
Big fan of Streamlets. I haven't touched on it already, so I'll touch on it now.
Okay, cool.
Lots of people look at this and go, you're asking me to put in my API keys. You're a security person. What are you thinking? And one of the reasons why I love working with Streamlit is that you've got your easily deployed Streamlit Community Cloud, and that's where I've run my demos. That's a completely free service hosted by Streamlit. Or you've got the option to wrap everything in a Docker container, or even just build it locally on your machine and just use the Streamlit library and know that it's just running there. And there's very limited caching of data. So once you put in your API key, it's there for the life of the session on your machine. Even if you hit refresh, it then gets wiped. And so for me, wanting people to work with OpenAI and to demonstrate the power of LLMs and to do practical demos without having to put in my own API key and fund everyone else's development and testing, it's really helpful, because I know that I'm not retaining any of that data, and I'm confident that Streamlit aren't retaining any of that data because of the way that they've designed their library.
Yeah, but also from a UI development, I can see on your code, it just makes your coding much more cleaner, straightforward, and it's a cool development API, isn't it?
Yeah, again, I really like it. I think it works very nicely. There are some wrinkles when it comes to the way that Streamlit works from top to bottom. It loads each of those particular UI components. And I think once you've got that clear in your head, it makes quite a lot of sense. So I have experimented with Gradio as well, which is part of Hugging Face. Again, very similar concept, but it doesn't have really the same hosting opportunity outside of something like Hugging Face Spaces, or if you deploy it on Google Colab or things like that. I just like the fact that with Streamlit, I can put it on Community Cloud and then quickly push out a demo to people to test.
Yeah. Do you know if Streamlit uses WebSockets or is all HTTP?
I don't know. Wouldn't want to say one way or the other.
Yeah, I think they do use WebSockets. All right, cool. All right, good stuff. No, really cool. I'm looking forward to demos. Come on, let's see it in action.
Yeah, sure. So lastly, one of the things that I introduced in version 0.4 was in one of the earlier versions, I sort of expanded the threat modeling methodology slightly. So it was no longer just Stride. It was also gave you the ability to produce attack trees, which is another very useful technique for looking at the different types of attacks that can be launched against an application. But it was very much an experimental service. It relied on Mermaid syntax, which is like a markdown type language for generating flowcharts or tree diagrams. And again, the model consistency wasn't entirely there. You'd often get different code block encapsulations, or a particular one was the usage of rounded brackets. The GPT models really like an acronym, and so you can't get it really to produce the words cross-site scripting without putting brackets XSS. And in Mermaid, rounded brackets are special characters that need to be escaped, and that will always cause a problem with rendering. Now, since again, with the greater model steerability, it's made that a lot better, and I invested quite a bit of time on the prompt engineering side of things to provide some examples to the model each time an attack tree is built. So just so that it's really clear on the required format. and to make sure that it's going to return as much as possible something that's valid and will render without the user having to go into the Mermaid syntax and look at what might be causing a particular rendering issue. Okay, so thought I'd demo just the core functionality of Stride GPT for you. I wasn't sure, because I'm running this from our offices, whether I'd be able to talk out to the OpenAI API to do this. So there's a few recorded ones, but I'm happy to do something in a live capacity if we've got the time and if people want the interest. But so we'll start off with just a basic threat modeling example. In this instance, I've pasted in a slightly more detailed description than I provide in the example. So in the left-hand nav, just to get you started, there's an example of a very simple application description just to run tests with and see how the tool works. This one I spent a bit more time refining, and effectively I'm trying to describe Facebook in this capacity. So you'll see that we go through all of the different components, the data types and sensitivity, and some details around the authorization access control that's in place. We'll then add those extra parameters that I mentioned before. So we'll say that it supports MFA, OAuth 2, basic authentication, and then we'll just go ahead and click Generate Threat Model. So because I'm not using streaming outputs, it takes around 30-40 seconds for the model to produce its output, and then it's rendered in one block back to the Streamlit UI. I did speed it up just in this video demo, so it should be appearing, yep, anytime now. And so you can see then that we have our threat model, each of the Stride categories, and a scenario for each of those threat types, along with the potential impact to explain what could go wrong. All I've done behind the scenes for this in the prompt template is to say that I want a markdown table with these 3 columns, and that each of the Stride categories must be covered. And then below that, as I mentioned earlier, there's the improvement suggestions. So even with all the detail that we've provided in this instance, the GPT model has still reviewed the information we provide and said, well, if you can actually tell me a bit more about perhaps the logging capabilities for user actions, then that would help me to provide an even more detailed model in return. And so you can go through this iterative process of downloading the model, starting again, and updating your application description. So that's the basic threat model element of Stride GPT. And what I'm doing in the background now is that once you've inputted the application description and generated that threat model, 2 JSON objects get returned. So one is the list of threats that come back, and the second is the improvement suggestions. For the following phases, we then ignore the improvement suggestions because we're only really interested in the threat model. And so when we go on to things like the attack tree, we're taking again that application description. You don't need to enter it again, and you can just continue to work through this process and say we'll generate an attack tree based on that application description and the information I've already provided. So again, this just takes a moment to, I think this is because of the level of information I've provided, it's generating quite a comprehensive attack tree in this instance. And so this is the mermaid syntax that I was referring to earlier. So it's producing this top-down graph structure. And there's a preview of the diagram. Rather than using that though, because particularly for larger diagrams, it's a bit difficult to see, I prefer to work with this Mermaid Live editor. So if we take the output from Stride GPT, paste that into this UI and refresh the table, we're going to take that to full screen. And we can see then that for each of our threat categories under the Stride methodology, we've got a list of potential attack vectors. So taking information disclosure, for example, we could have disclosure via error messages, perhaps a man in the middle attack on any data in transit, or some unauthorized API access. And then there's additional subcategories for, in that case, the unauthorized API access category.
Yeah, it's so cool, man. So one of the things I found is like, when from a usability point of view, having that interactivity actually makes an interesting difference. Like even on your brains, even just giving some clues on what's happening. I think that's why I think ChatGPT works so well, is because it almost felt instantaneous, because you start to see the response. And it's funny because as soon as you shift to the non-streaming, it feels so much slower, everything, right? Which is quite an interesting user experience element, right, of it.
Yeah, and I think some of the support for streaming has improved. When I was first doing this with Streamlit, the support wasn't great. So it may be something that I revisit in a future version, because again, I do feel like it. I completely agree. It does sort of great on the user experience to have to sit there and watch that progress just spin away.
Do you have a way to record the session, like, to keep coming back to it? Like once you
So
have
for each one, you can download either the threat model, or you can download the attack tree or the mitigations that we'll move on to. Because I'm not looking to retain any data or any content that anybody's putting into this tool, I haven't done anything like session management or logins or anything like that for this.
Yeah. I'm saying to continue, right? Because I feel that a lot of this is like the threat models. Like what gets interesting is the evolution, or even to do it live while you have a session with
Yeah.
the participants. So really cool. So I think Benjamin said he had a couple of questions. So
Yeah, hi. Thanks.
Hi, Becky.
You were talking about the iterative approach that you can take to this threat modeling, but I didn't understand how do you answer those improvement suggestions? Like what part of the user interface lets you do that? And yeah, let's start there. Like I just didn't catch where you're going to go type that back in.
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. You would just take your original application description that you provided, and you would update that with the additional details and then resubmit it.
Oh, it's not got any kind of memory about what you've typed before. It's kind of blank slate every time.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
And one of my that is fairly deliberate. One of the things that I've observed is allowing that sort of back and forth interaction with a language model increases the risk, because you can start to build, or an attacker or somebody wants to misuse your application, can then start to use these sorts of persuasion-based attacks. And so rather than entertaining any of that, I just take each the application description and each of that set of supporting data, and we just do it, single shot each time. There's no additional context or anything like that. But obviously, this is all open source. If you wanted to introduce like a chat memory and iterate on that, then that would definitely be possible.
Cool. And then the part that we were typing in there with the application details, like do I need to type that in a separate text file and copy and paste, or can I get it back out again, what I already typed? Because that's what I need to iterate on,
Yeah, so I would keep that in a separate document and then come work on that and then keep coming back again. Because this is a demo and it's really designed to raise awareness of what I think is a good use case for LLMs in cybersecurity. There are some things like that I haven't addressed in this UI. So yeah, absolutely. That would be something that you could say. So after the threat model gets generated, there's a button that appears down here which says download output. So you could easily replace that with one that says download application description and threat model, and then take that and pass it back in. That would again be possible.
All right, cool. Thank you. That's it for now. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I
So
think those collaboration features are probably quite important, because it's that iterative thing, right? In a way, you're now showing that this is possible, and it's when we start to refine and when we have templates. The thing that I really love about this is that we can finally start to have some really, really good examples of what good threat models look like, and it's all created from a prompt, isn't it? And then you can just modify the prompt a bit, and then you got almost something that's customized to you, which is pretty insane.
yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the, let's spin it into the, sorry, just bear with me a second. So if you look at the repo, for example, in this main file, right, the prompts are incredibly generic. I'm just saying, act as a cybersecurity expert with a lot of experience, all of that sort of thing that you would, classic role playing for a large language model. But for somebody using this in a more tailored capacity, I think you would absolutely always update that to say, you are working in the retail sector, or you're working in financial services, because that again is going to get that really generalized large language model, if we're using a GPT model, to focus a bit more on threats that are relevant to retail, financial services, healthcare, whatever your chosen industry is. You've probably also got the ability to provide some more details about defenses that your users or your threat modelers might not necessarily be aware of or always think to include in a description. So you'd say, look, you don't need to worry about this because we've got we use AWS WAF in front of all of our web applications, or we're using Akamai or another service. So yeah, additional context that you could just include with every threat modeling request, that I think would help to again improve the quality.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And I think the power here, which is, if you think about it, most of the logic of what you just created comes from that prompt, isn't it? It's like that simple prompt. And then actually, if you scroll down a little bit on the code, there's a really bit there where you actually have the bits where you put it all together. That one. No, not that one. I think there was one where you go input the bits, the threat model, the description, the stuff, right? Isn't it like the bit where you actually construct the bigger prompt for
yeah
that goes to the user,
so
right?
Yeah, it's in. So this is where we're picking up all of the details from the Streamlit UI, and then I think, is it down here? It's been a while. It's been a month or so since I've looked at this code. But yeah, if we take this as an example, it might be up here actually. Threat
actually,
model.
it's at the beginning. It's literally on line 32.
Oh, 32, right? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. So yeah, the prompt. So again, this is where we're taking those parameters from the UI and dropping them into the prompt template. And this was where I started with Stride GPT in version 0.1. And when I came across LangChain and this idea of prompt templating, I thought it just made so much sense to improve the consistency, and that your users don't need to know how to prompt. They just need to provide some basic information about that they understand and know, and then the prompt can take care of the rest, which I think is really powerful.
But this in a way is I think in the interesting part of where we are with the tech, right? Because as once ChatGPT and others, right, and the other foundation models increase the prompt size to a good amount, right, suddenly this became possible, isn't it? Because you can now create, what in essence are massive prompts, right? This can be a prompt of 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 characters, right? Sorry, words, right? At that level. But the coolest thing is that you get all the context there, right? And then if you modify something, you don't have to rebuild the whole lot. You just modify the prompt, which is where you modify for example, one of the authentication methods or one of the thingy types or one of the stuff here, and that gives you the almost the prompt that then is given to the language model, which then used to produce the output, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There are some issues with like longer prompts and longer context where you can get, I think there's a problem called lost in the middle, where the language models, a bit like people, tend to pay more attention to the start of the conversation and to the end, and get a bit fuzzy about the stuff in the middle. So I think if you were to work on something that used a really long prompt, you might encounter some of those issues. But yeah, that's again, that's a prompt engineering problem.
Or to create multiple sets of prompts, right? Where each prompt creates the materials for the next prompt, right? And then that's where I think LangChain has some cool ideas, right? But in a way, we start here, right? And then that gives you the whole thing. And then, yeah, there's that example of the JSON that you provide, right? That you get it, which is really cool.
Yeah, so just while we were here, I thought I'd find the, yeah, this is the work that I put into coercing, if we put it nicely, the model into producing valid syntax. So there's a single shot example there of what it looks like. And there's a reminder that you must only respond in this particular format. And another reminder not to use round brackets. And this is just through a process of trial and error, which I think is at the heart of these language model systems.
Exactly. Very cool.
So if we move on to mitigations, again, really straightforward, using what we've already built up to then produce a suggested list of mitigations for the threats that were identified during the initial threat modeling process. And if we went back and checked the example video from the first round, you'd see that the first one related to spoofing and phishing. And again, that's where taking that JSON object, taking the threat information out of it, and then bringing it back in this phase and putting it into that prompt, it allows for that consistency. And that's something that, particularly since November last year, this has worked a lot better than previously. It's really helped to cut down on the variability.
Yeah. And then you can see how this can then be taken into other tools, right? Or other systems, and you can feed in. And that's why, there's an interesting element here of you could also start to feed in your own IDs, right? Imagine you already had these mappings internally. You can say, if it's one of these, use this particular ID, use this particular stuff. So then your graph starts to work internally, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Very cool.
And then finally, demo 4. This is a really short one, and I did cover it. I've hit the proxy. Right, just bear with me just a second, because I'm going to have to drop off.
Right.
So the demo 4 is really straightforward in terms of enabling the Azure OpenAI service. I touched on it earlier. It's as simple as toggling that toggle there, and just providing the information that you get from Azure Portal. So you'll get an API key that you'll need to insert into that field. And then you also get an endpoint, which you need to specify, which ends in openai.azure.com. And then lastly, there's a deployment name, which will be something that you set. So whatever you've called your OpenAI deployments in the Azure portal, just put that in there. And then that's as easy as I think I can make it to use the OpenAI service on Azure and make it swappable with the OpenAI API.
Yeah, I'm interested to see when you can play around, because what I like about AWS is now with Bedrock, they have a lot of other models. So it'll be interesting to start play around and see how they also face. But I know that, jumping from, ChatGPT to another model is not as trivial as it could be, right? But it'll be interesting to start comparing the models.
Yeah, and I've got a slide on future development, so I'll come back to that point because I think that's, yeah, it's quite an interesting one, and there's definitely quite a few people that have their own preferences for different models and different services, and it's something that
and the costing of it, right, will eventually be relevant to this. Doug, do you have a question? Do you want to ask it? Or I can ask for you if you want.
Yeah, I was just curious about seeing the mitigations demo, but also I was wondering, have you thought about a piece that helps you generate a description for the application, sort of pre-processing that, maybe that could take in a description and then say, oh, I don't see this consideration, or I don't see this described, and suggest more places to enhance the description before putting it into the Stride GPT?
There is something in the future plans slide that I'll come back to, which is really about like taking in information. But in terms of like, having the tool help you through that process, that's sort of fulfilled by the improvement suggestions. But yes, there could be a way of then just not taking it through the threat modeling process and just providing an additional field where you could spend a few minutes refining your initial application description. That's definitely something I can consider.
Cool. Sounds good.
So in this section, I think the jury's still out. I think in a lot of areas around whether LLMs are useful, if it's just a load of snake oil. There are those, and I'll put myself in this bracket, which I think, you know, I'm very enthusiastic. I know Dennis is in that bracket as well, about the potential for using these tools in cybersecurity and helping to address some of the key challenges that we've got as an industry. But I thought I'd just share some of the feedback that I've had, because I think it's, you know, it's a really powerful testament to how people are already using this. It's just a personal project that I've developed, pushed it out on GitHub. I've mentioned it on LinkedIn, and you know, getting this sort of feedback, I think, is really encouraging to see the mindset of people out there who are willing to adopt and play with it. So as you can see, you know, time to throw away the spreadsheets. I think that's, you know, absolutely great to hear. Obviously, the feedback on the Azure OpenAI service working great is very encouraging, and the consistency with the original OpenAI API that I was using. And also that idea of saving time on research and threat intel. So, you know, this is using a generic model. You know, it's not specifically trained to do threat modeling, but I think that's certainly an opportunity as well, is that you could take some of the newer models that are emerging, or even a fine-tuned version of something like Mistral or one of the other open weight models that is fine-tuned on threat modeling, and even your own specific threat intel, and, you know, get some very accurate results out of this. So I think it's really good to see the how people are already thinking about this. And then just in sort of hard numbers to back that up. So as I mentioned earlier, I don't do any sort of logging or data retention through Stride GPT. The only thing I can see is through Streamlit Community Cloud, the number of people that access the hosted version of Stride GPT. And that's already at 4,000 plus unique users. And I've logged in a few times to look at the stats just out of interest, and it doesn't matter really what time of the day that I log in. I see something very similar to that picture on this slide, which is, you know, multiple new users every hour, which I think, yeah, is great, and again really encouraging to see the adoption and enthusiasm for tools like this. And the same for the GitHub repo. It's one of the few metrics that I have to track the adoption of this type of tool. And you know, you can sort of see the bumps that come along with each release and when I publicize it. So thanks to the people that have forked the repository and have come back for ideas and suggestions. That's really really appreciated.
Cool.
And
Yeah.
so then
Actually, just mention another little comment on. Would be interesting to have it leverage meter attack as threats, right? The meter attack, attack CK, right? As the threads. That would be. I agree.
Yes.
Luis is also asking any licensing restrictions. You open source it, right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's all open source. All the licensing details are in the repo. So I think this one's an MIT license, if I remember. Yeah. So very open and permissive, even for commercial usage. So then on the future roadmap, I've just got a few ideas that I'm working on alongside my other projects. I'd like to, the idea of having Stride GPT take a diagram that you've drawn in Excalidraw or Draw AI or something like that, or even a whiteboard sketch, and then produce a threat model, I think would be really cool. So that's something that I'm looking to implement in the future. It may not get you to the same level of detail as providing that textual description, or the same. I think it's quite an interesting thing to integrate. And one of the reasons why I build tools like this is as much for my own learning as it is to share interesting things with the broader community. And I think working with that vision model is definitely on my radar for this project and some of the others that I'm working on. Back to the point that we covered with Dennis earlier, I'd definitely like to start to support open source or open weight LLMs. There's a couple of different options that I'm looking at for that. So I've recently got access to the Mistral API. So that might be one that I include, or providing something like running the text generation web UI on a service like RunPod, for example, so like a cloud-hosted GPU service. That would be another option, which I think would be broadly accessible to a number of other users. There's always a problem, I think, when going down this route, and one of the reasons why I chose the GPT models is because I think they're the most widely used at the moment. Picking a winner out of open source at the moment is quite challenging, but it is something that I want to try and support, again, because I think it'd be quite an interesting experience to work around the prompt engineering challenges, because no language model is entirely consistent in the way that it takes stop tokens or different prompt input formats, and that creates some challenges for the people building, working with these models or working with tools based on these models to make sure that things are consistent. But as soon as I've got something I think will work and will work consistently to at least the same quality as GPT 3.5, then that's something that I'm looking to incorporate into the tool. Back to the question that was asked earlier around helping with the application description and refining that. One of the ideas that I think, Dennis, you perhaps raised this previously in one of our conversations, was being able to point Stride GPT at a GitHub repo or a GitLab repo and taking the README file and perhaps even some of the code base if it's an open source project, and then producing an application description on the back of that. So that's something that I'm definitely considering.
Also, just on that one, there's also a lot of practices of, for example, having JSON files with metadata and with structure. There's also other, I think Luis who's actually here. Actually, he played around, I think, with the idea of having threat models described as code, and I think there's others. I've seen that, so you can leverage a bit of that. Where it's almost like there's some cool metadata that you can already grab from a repo. So if we can grab that, can you imagine that you can use that to create a threat model much more effectively, because you can connecting those dots.
Yep. And then lastly, you've seen that the GitHub repo's there. I'm happy to take new feature requests. If you raise an issue or a pull request, on the repo, or even message me on LinkedIn, then that's fine. And who knows what ideas will come from the community. So happy to have a discussion about that and see how we can improve this tool still further. So I think we've got a few minutes for Q&A, Dennis, if there's anybody has dropped anything else into the chat.
Yeah, any more questions? Anybody wants to drop in? I think we answered all of the ones I've seen.
Okay.
If not, I think we're good. Thanks for, okay, well, let's absolutely pencil in one in 3 months from now, right? Because I think the evolution is going to be quite dramatically, right? And this was a great session, man. And I think it shows the potential in a great direction as a really useful tool.
Yeah, thanks very much. Again, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a personal project and one that I think is helpful for people to see the potential value of large language models, particularly in the context of solving problems in cybersecurity that we've had for years. So please take a look at the GitHub repo, play around with it. If you've got any questions, just contact me. You can also play with the Streamit app. That's completely free, apart from the fact that you need to use your own OpenAI or Azure OpenAI token. But otherwise, please play around and let me know what you think.
Cool.
I did have a quick question.
Oh, sorry. Oh, go on.
What reaction have you had from the non-security user community? Like if I'm an application developer and has it been, have they sort of been involved in using it, or has it been more a security person using their application guidance and doing it? Just curious about that.
Yeah, so it is just because of my network. Obviously, the initial wave of users has been largely cybersecurity people, but sharing this with some people that are less technical but work in security, but also then developers who are less familiar with the ins and outs of threat modeling, I think it really helps to or they found it really useful to see even an example of what we mean when we say you need to produce a threat model for this application. And that's something that I've been at organizations previously where they've produced maybe something diagrammed out using the Microsoft threat modeling tool or one of the other threat modeling tools that's out there. But it still doesn't really help, I think, for the developer to get to grips with the mindset that's required. And that's something I think comes more naturally to security people. And I think this is where we can bridge the gap, because the application developer can describe their application or the functionality and the components, and then very quickly get a model produced in response to that, or an attack tree, and then start to think about the ways that things can go wrong, or how they might be attacked. And I think that the feedback has been, it's really helpful to quickly clarify what we mean when we say different types of threats or different types of attacks that perhaps a developer hasn't come across before or even heard of. So I think, it's been positive from that standpoint as well.
Nice. Maybe I can sneak in one last. Any thoughts on sort of maybe a future direction in terms of mitigations, tying it to OWASP guidance, or even companies that have their own internal policies, being able to maybe it's another stage that says, okay, well, here's the threat model, but here's the guidance that it put out. How do I map that to my internal policies or more detailed OWASP guidance?
Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion. Just off the top of my head, there's normally an issue with where you want to draw, where you want to pull back references. So one of my other tools that uses the MITRE ATT&CK framework, when I first started developing that or testing it, the language model will just hallucinate the combinations of the technique ID and the technique name. And so you can never accurately get the two to match. The way that I
Right.
became that was by having a pandas data frame sit in the back end, and then really didn't give the model the chance to hallucinate those techniques for a particular threat actor group. So it was doing a lookup programmatically, and it was passing that to the language model to then build like a threat actor scenario on the back of that. Just thinking out loud, I'd be thinking of something similar, where you would then pass in, you know, the relevant control references and maybe a brief description mapped to each threat category. So if you've got denial of service, you might then say, well, we know we've got your WAF, we've got anti-lockout, we've got, you know, however many controls and all of those references. That would be sort of how I'd start to think about doing that. Otherwise, you're into a RAG, a retrieval augmented generation type solution, which you could provide your control documents, your documentation. But again, for a demo proof of concept type tool, which is ultimately what this is, that's probably taking it a step beyond where I think most people would find it useful or be comfortable using. But clearly for somebody wanting to work with the open source project and build on that, I think that's, you know, a good avenue for further improvement.
Very cool. Thank you.
Okay, Dennis, so I think we're wrapping up.
Brilliant. Good stuff. Then thanks a lot, and I'll see you on the next ones.
Yeah, thanks everyone.